Shalom and welcome to On the House, the podcast where industry experts and professionals discuss real estate in Israel. I'm your host, Debbie Goldfisher, real estate agent, founder and editor-in-chief of buyitinisrael.com. Join us as we explore market trends, legal and tax issues, purchasing tips, neighborhoods throughout Israel, and much more. All this is On the House, helping you make the right move. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us today for the first episode of our second season of On the House. This season will be all about purchasing new construction or off-plan, as we say in Hebrew, al haniyah. In Israel, there is a huge amount of new construction and redevelopment taking place all over the country. In fact, approximately 40% of sale transactions in Israel are off-plan, and as of last month, there were close to 70,000 new homes under construction. For many people looking to purchase in Israel, new construction makes a lot of sense. You get a brand new home that is built to high standards of construction and safety with a warranty. You can pay off in installments. You can customize your home and upgrade the finishings. You don't have to deal with renovations. There's no chain in the purchase process, and you can get a great deal on price and payment terms. Over the past 3 months, we've had loads of traffic through the Barav Israel website from people who specifically want to purchase new construction. And therefore, I decided we would dedicate an episode to help buyers understand what exactly this entails and to guide you through the process. We're going to have several different guests over the coming weeks, each one with a different area of expertise and experience. And as you may know already, this industry is dominated by Israeli families and established businesses, but I tried my hardest to bring on those rare professionals and industry experts who are native Anglos and true English speakers who have the ability to share with us their professional knowledge and insights in the language we all know and understand, and with the cultural background and sensitivity that we're used to. For this opening episode, which is going to be an introduction to purchasing off-plan in Israel, I'm delighted to welcome Ellie Gertel. Ellie was born and raised in Boston into the third generation of a family of entrepreneurs who are active in the fields of real estate, investments, and trade in the U.S. And today, Ellie is the founder and CEO of the Barav Real Estate Development company in Israel, which builds, manages, and markets real estate projects across Israel. Ellie called his company Barav, short for Abraham's blessing, after his grandfather Avraham Leibovich gave him his blessing to immigrate to Israel in order to fulfill the Zionist dream, exactly as written in Avraham Avinu's blessing. And the Lord said to Avraham, "Leave your country, your birthplace, and the home of your father, and go live in the land which I will show you." And today, as anti-Semitism rages across the world, and even the US, our supposed closest ally, refused to veto the UN resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, Jews all over the world are feeling less and less comfortable outside of our homeland. This blessing that God gave to our forefather Abraham rings so loud in our ears. The words are more applicable than ever before for Jews to come home. With that, Ellie, welcome, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Pleasure. So, Ellie, tell us a little bit about what you do at Barav and how you got into this industry.
So, Barav is a classic real estate development company. From the process of purchasing land to the process of financing a project, process of getting plans from the city, permits, zoning, dealing with engineers and architects, dealing with sales, dealing with banks, the whole slew of whatever is needed in order to build a project. We do both residential and commercial, as well as hire the kablan, the general contractor, in order to build our building.
That's really amazing. And could you tell us, how did you get into this business?
So as you mentioned, I sort of have it in my blood. My family has been involved in real estate in Boston and New England for quite a long time. And when I first came here, I knew that it was something that I wanted to get involved in. We moved here August of 2004. At the time today we have 4 daughters and a son.
Beautiful.
My son was born a few years after my grandfather that you mentioned passed away. We named him Abe or Abi. And we even have 2 grandchildren today as well.
B'li ayin hara, ken yirbu, as they say. They should just continue and increase.
Amen. So I knew I wanted to get involved in real estate here in Israel. I ended up buying 2 separate apartments or condos in Yerushalayim. Thankfully, I didn't lose too much money on those because they were really my first introduction on a very small scale to the real estate business here in Israel. I learned a new language, both Hebrew as well as real estate language in terms of appraisers, contractors, area, and architects and engineers. And it really worked out well, meaning I was able to learn a new business. We had sold our house in Silver Spring, Maryland, which is where we moved from. And I was able to use that money in order to really get into the real estate business here. We did that once in a very small unit in Yerushalayim, in the German colony. And then I did it again in Rehavia. Again, thankfully, I didn't lose too much money on those particular renovations, but it was an incredible learning experience that took probably between the two of them about 1.5 to 2 years, where I was really able to fully understand, the real estate market here in Israel and everything that it entails.
That's beautiful. It's funny because I remember when my husband and I built our house as well, it was also about a 1-year-long process, and the learning experience, not just the real estate construction business, but the actual language and the terminology was amazing. I learned things that I would never have picked up had I been reading a book or not building a house. So I understand that.
Yeah, I mean, the tax authority and the Arnona and the municipality, the zoning laws, the permitting stages, how finances work, how construction loans work, how appraisals work, how mortgages work, sort of the whole gamut, and also the actual construction itself and dealing with the contractor, dealing with suppliers.
Kol kavod. I mean, there are not too many Americans that get off the boat and throw themselves in and involve themselves in industries that are so Israeli dominated and require so much language and skill that we don't necessarily come with. So,
right. Just to give you an idea as to one of the ways that just shows sort of my being wet behind the ears. I remember we purchased flooring for my contractor. I told him that I wanted to buy it directly from the store. And we had about 100 meters or so of flooring that I had to bring. And the truck comes and drops it off outside in front of the apartment building.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the apartment that I was renovating was on the 3rd floor. And I asked him who's bringing up all this flooring that was obviously very, very heavy up to the 3rd floor. You can imagine the response that I got from the truck driver.
Goodness.
And then when I spoke to the contractor, he says, I didn't prepare for that. So
welcome to Israel.
Yeah, it was sort of a little bit of a learning experience in terms of just sort of making silly mistakes. Thankfully, that didn't cost me too much money. I always say, I know I'm going to make mistakes. I just hope that my mistakes that I make aren't going to be too expensive.
Right. Okay, well, hopefully you earn that money back.
Yeah.
So as you know, Ellie, our listeners are all English speakers, and most of them are from abroad. And this is a whole new world for these people. And our goal here is to enlighten and explain and guide people along the process. So first of all, I want to ask you, you mentioned in your introduction that you bring in a contractor. So what are you? What is your role? And what is the role of the contractor?
So that's a question that I get asked a lot in terms of just sort of defining roles. In my company, we built a large project in Haifa. There was a total of 7 buildings and 225 condos. That was sort of my big project that I first built after these 2 renovation jobs.
That's a big jump.
In Yerushalayim. It was a pretty big jump.
When was that?
That was in 2010 or so, 2011.
How did you go from 2 apartments in Yerushalayim to a whole complex in Haifa?
So I think I got lucky in terms of some of the networking that I was able to do. There were a bunch of people that I knew here that introduced me to who ended up being my partner for that whole project. And yeah, it really, I always say that, for the 2-hour drive that it always took me to drive back home after Haifa, this was really right after my grandfather had passed away. I remember I used to talk to him on my way back, and I used to sort of thank him for somehow or other introducing me or setting up the stars where I was able to be introduced to my partner. And it really ended up working great. At a certain point, I thought I'd be buried in Haifa because there was I was always there. We had a sales office, and I ended up sleeping in the sales office a few times a week. And it was really, really very much a learning experience for me on a much larger scale. But basically, if you can think of a homeowner, I am comparable to the homeowner, right? The homeowner buys a piece of land or sometimes even buys a home. The homeowner then needs to hire an architect if he wants to do renovations, if he wants to build a home, if there's nothing on the piece of land right now. He needs to go to the municipality and get permitting or get zoning. And then he has a set of plans. That would be called a developer. From a residential perspective, that could be a homeowner. From my perspective, it's a developer where I'm not looking to build one home, but I'm looking to build, an apartment building. But conceptually, it's the same idea. Once that is done, I then have plans, I have permits, I have bank financing, I have equity that I raise from my investors, and then I go out to bid to a general contractor, otherwise known as the kablan, for him to build my building. Historically, here in Israel, people have used sort of as a slang the word kablan to refer to both of those individuals, both the yazam, the developer, as well as the kablan as the builder. But just defining terms, that really is the distinction. Sometimes you can have one person do the same thing. There are times where you have a developer who buys the land, and he also is the main point contact for the actual construction. Sometimes the person that you're buying the home from is also the general contractor who's building the building, that you can have that too. Just because they're two separate titles doesn't mean that the same person can't fill both roles.
Sure. In Hebrew, we call the developer the yazam.
Yes.
What does that word come from?
Liyazem is like a sort of an entrepreneur. Is used in other industries as well.
Right. So we have the yazam, who is the developer, the entrepreneur, and then the kablan, who is the contractor. And when we're looking for a project, what are we looking for in both a yazam and a contractor? So
like in any industry, you try to find people who have reputable names. You want to try to find people who have already done projects, who are familiar with how the process works. And, from the developer's perspective, it's interesting sort of how to distinguish between the two. What's really critical from a developer's perspective is the financing. You never want to be in a situation as a potential buyer who's buying on paper where, God forbid, something happens to the developer and there isn't enough financing in order to finish the project. Mm-hmm. That's from mainly from the developer's perspective, but it's also his ability to have some form of flexibility. As you mentioned before, when you buy on paper, there are many people who want to make some change orders. You have some of these larger developers that pretty much say to buyers, look, I'm not interested in having any change orders. It just takes up too much of his time. Usually when you're dealing with large scale developers, and the levels that we're describing in terms of larger buildings, those developers don't like change orders.
Right.
The type of people who like change orders are, again, going back to the analogy of the individual homeowner. So there you have a smaller contractor who loves change orders because then it's just going to give him more money. Mm-hmm. But as it relates to a larger project, the longer that the project takes, the more it's going to cost to the actual contractor. So you want flexibility from the seller, who's the developer. And insofar as the contractor, you also want to make sure that he's done projects like similar to what you're describing and what you're doing. Mm-hmm. You often sort of find yourself in a situation where, a contractor could have a really nice name and a really good name, but if you do some questioning and looking into other buildings that he's built, the real key is after the contractor has handed over the keys, how responsive is he to potential problems? Because there is no such thing as a building that gets built from scratch without problems. It doesn't exist. Sure. What distinguishes the good developers and the developers that you want to try to avoid, as well as the contractor really, are the ones who don't answer phones, who don't respond, and who don't get back to you when things are needed. And they are always needed, whether it's electrical, whether it's plumbing, whether it's leaking from roofs, or whether it's anything else of a whole slew of different issues that may come up. You're always looking for that type of contractor that can offer that to you.
Service.
Yeah.
So when you purchase from off-plan, you're purchasing from the developer.
Yes.
Right? And after you take possession, if there are any problems, who are you in touch with?
So after they take possession of the apartment, after the keys are already given over, which means that you've already paid in full for the apartment. More often than not, the way that I do my projects is that my contractor is the one who is in touch directly with the buyers. He's the one who is there when we deliver the apartment, which is the reason why I like using the same contractor for a lot of my projects, because I know that he takes on responsibility for that. And he's the one who is really in touch with the individual owner. Usually over the course of the first couple of months, there's a whole slew of different issues that may come up. We try to prevent them as much as possible. Usually at delivery of the apartment, we ask the owner to come in to sort of do what we refer to as a pre-trial delivery. Mm-hmm. They'll walk around. Sometimes the owner will even bring his own engineer. I would actually recommend that for most owners when they receive an apartment, to bring someone who is a professional who can point out things.
We're gonna have a whole episode on that in a few weeks. Yeah,
and then for him to be able to point out to the contractor what it is that he wants to have done, and then he'll come back a week or two later in order to make the final payment and to actually take over the keys. Great. Take the keys on.
Great. Okay. So, Ellie, why would you encourage people to buy new construction as opposed to a pre-owned home?
Right. So look, there are a lot of, it's like anything else in life, right? There's a lot of positives and there are some negatives as well. I can tell you that my dad, he bought an apartment in Jerusalem a bunch of years ago, and he said, under no circumstances am I buying on plan. So I said, Daddy, well, what happens if, you build something in one of our buildings? I'm not interested. So, you have situations sometimes where people are just sort of set in their ways, and they would much rather have to scale 1-to-1 than to be able to have to look at plans and tell you, okay, I want to move this wall here and I want to move that wall there. They would just rather be able to walk into an apartment and see, this is what I want. If I want to make changes afterwards, I'll bring in, a small contractor and he'll do some renovation jobs for me. Much fewer surprises than, if you're buying on paper. Mm-hmm. As to why someone would want to buy on paper, so culturally here in Israel, there is an interest historically for people to own their own homes. I think that there is a lot of historical reasons for that, cultural reasons for that. For Jews around the world, they just like to own their own homes. Sure. You don't have many projects here in Israel that are only for rentals. Most projects here in Israel are all condominiums, which is owner-occupied, owner-owned. Some of them are landlords that they could rent out, but you don't typically find major projects just for rentals. And from that perspective, people want to have new things, similar to other industries that you may want to buy something, a large purchase, clothing, automobiles, cars, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So phones, all those kind of things, people like to have their own. It's new, and they're able to really take advantage of something that otherwise, could be rickety, mm-hmm. could have problems and could have issues. Number one. Number two, you also have an individual or a company that will back any potential issues and challenges that you may have when you receive it. In addition to all of that, you have flexibility. Like oftentimes, especially if you get in early and the apartment has not yet been built, there's many opportunities for you as the buyer to go to the contractor, what's referred to as shinuyei dayarim, mm-hmm. which is change orders of the owner, depending on what they are. Sometimes it doesn't even cost any extra money. All of a sudden, you thought you wanted to buy a 4-bedroom apartment, but you realize that if you knock down one of the walls, it's a 3-bedroom apartment, and all of a sudden your main living area room, which is called a salon here in Israel, is much, much larger, et cetera. Right. These are sort of smaller examples, but you have that flexibility, not just from the perspective of how you separate the rooms in the apartment, but also if someone wants to have much nicer tiling, much nicer kitchen, much nicer, toilets and mm-hmm. sinks and whatnot.
Like to upgrade the finishings.
Always you have that ability, and almost all projects that exist here in Israel have that opportunity. Obviously, the later that you request it, when things are already done, the harder it is to do, if at all. And if it is an option, then it's going to cost that much more money in order to rip things out and make changes.
Right. Like, for example, to add a second sink in the kitchen, if you do that after you take possession, you've got to stop ripping up the floors and adding more piping and preparation for, another sink on the other side of the kitchen. If you do it while it's being built, it'll cost a fraction of the price. Another thing I'd like to add is the entrance price. I don't know of any project in Israel, since I've been in this business now 20 years, I don't know of any project that has gone down in price from when it was being sold. In other words, you come in at the lowest possible rung of the ladder, and it just goes up from there. That's historically. I can't promise what's going to happen in the future, but the way things are going, I don't think they're going to come down. So it's an opportunity to really come in at the earliest possible stage and please God to watch it appreciate from there on.
Yeah, I mean, I've had a number of people who have invested with my company who also were buyers of apartments. So they sort of wore two different hats. They came in as equity partners that I raised money for my project, but he also came in as a buyer. Mm-hmm. And we were able to give him very good payment terms where, just as an example, if the purchase price of the apartment, just to make numbers easy. Unfortunately, there aren't many apartments in Israel that only cost 1 million shekel today, but let's just make...
I don't know of any.
Yeah, just make in terms of the math, typically the buyer that would come in and would want to purchase an apartment would have to put in at least anywhere between 15 and 20%. Sometimes there's even some aggressive developers that could even take a little bit less than that. But let's assume that you're looking at that amount of money that you have to put down of 150 to 200,000 shekel. Obviously, you have some additional costs in terms of taxes. If you have a typical lawyer, you have some lawyers' fees, brokers, et cetera. But in terms of the actual cost, you're only putting in 15 to 20% of the money. Mm-hmm. And if the value of the apartment, as it gets closer and closer to the time of taking possession, as you mentioned, many, many projects around the country, especially if they're in good locations, increase in value as you get closer and closer. So the amount of return that individual buyer could potentially generate is significantly higher than just the additional 10, 15, 20% because he only put in a small amount of money to begin with in order to take possession of the apartment.
Absolutely. And that brings me to an important point, which is that until a few years ago, the builders were in a very strong position. They had purchased land at relatively cheaper purchase prices. They had borrowed money at very low interest rates, and the market was buzzing. And they were in a strong position where they were able to request higher installments upfront and throughout the duration of the construction. Today, things are different, and the market is definitely quieter here. The local market is quieter. And they are offering some very attractive terms. Many kabbalim, many developers and builders, construction companies are offering terms such as what we call 10-90, 20-80, meaning 10 or 20% upfront and the rest closer towards the end. Some require a payment in the middle, but very often a lot of them are not asking for anything before the close to the completion date. And in addition to that, a very important word for anyone who's doing business in Israel is something called the madad, which is the index. Anything you owe in Israel, any money outstanding is linked to some kind of inflationary index, which as time goes on, that the money that you owe is basically worth less than when you borrowed it. So that money has to be linked to an index. When it comes to real estate, it's linked to the construction cost index, which is basically a basket of items that are the cost of construction. For example, iron, steel, concrete, and all the materials that are used to build buildings. And historically, the price was linked to the construction cost index. So if you put down 20%, then you owed 80%, and that amount would be linked to the index. A new law came out a couple of years ago, a year and a half ago, which basically changed that. Only 50% of the outstanding amount that you owe is linked to the index. So, for example, if you put down 20% upfront, you owe 80%, and only half of that, in other words, 40% of the purchase price will be linked to the index. As soon as you've paid that off, the remaining amount is linked to the index. A lot of the builders today are offering no linkage, no what we call hatzmada. Tzamud means a link, so hatzmada is linkage. So some of the builders are offering no linkage. But even those that are linking to the construction cost index because they are themselves exposed to the potential inflation, again, it's only 40% on the amount you owed. So it's not as significant as it would have been a few years ago. Last year and the year before, inflation was pretty high here in Israel as a result of COVID and the war in the Ukraine and various other factors, macroeconomic factors. But thankfully, the inflation seems to have stabilized, and we hope that, please God, it will continue in that direction. So
it sounds complicated, but basically the concept, you're absolutely right, is if I'm the seller as a developer in my project and someone gives me all the money, continue to use that same example of the 1 million shekel apartment. If he or she gives me all the money up front, then to me, that's very valuable as a seller, as a developer. If he or she comes to me and says, I only want to give you 20%. So as you mentioned, the remaining 80%, or in the example of the 1,000,000 shekel, the 800,000 shekel, will be linked to the index, as you mentioned. And the concept basically is that the value of the money today is worth more than if you paid it to me in a couple of years from now after we finish the project. And that's exactly what ends up happening, not just from the buyer toward the seller, but quite frankly, me as a developer, my entire contract that I have with all of my suppliers, my general contractor, my kablan, is also linked to that same index.
Sure.
And if I'm paying him a lot of money over the course of the project, so over time, because of the fact that I'm not paying him obviously all one lump sum in advance, I'm paying him over time. It's all linked to the index of when I originally signed it with him.
Right. So I know that for many people from overseas, this is a very foreign concept and something that is hard to wrap one's head around. Some contractors or some developers offer a lump sum payment that you can pay add onto the price of the property. And then there is no linkage, which it really comes down to risk aversity. If somebody can't handle the risk, but they're willing to pay a bit more upfront, then that's an option. The way that I look at it, and I tell my clients this, as Ellie alluded to, that the money is worth more now. It will cost probably more to borrow the money now than what it will cost to link it to the index. So again, it's a matter of choice and it's a matter of aversity to risk. One other thing that's very important for people to remember when you're buying off plan, it may be very enticing to buy something where you only have to put down 15 or 20%, but you have to remember that you will have to come up with the rest of the money in 2, 3, 4 years' time, whatever the agreement is. And before you make a purchase and sign an agreement, you must make sure that you are pre-approved to finance to get a loan, or that you have money available or will have money available so that you don't, God forbid, run into any trouble. Ellie, I want to talk now about the risks that are involved in purchasing off plan. In particular, I get a lot of questions. What happens if the builder goes bankrupt? What happens if the development is delivered late? Also, everybody knows today we have a shortage of workers in the country. How does that impact the purchase? And anything else? Tell us about the risks.
There are a couple of different factors. One, as it relates to the financial risk. What happens here in Israel is that it's actually a very, very organized method where banks today really control the entire project. Once buyers want to go in on a project, if it's really, really early, they end up putting approximately 7% of the amount into escrow. And that money is obviously protected because it's sitting in escrow.
That's what we call pre-sale.
Pre-sale.
Before the developer even has the permits to build. So he's already starting to sell, but he doesn't have anything to sell yet.
Correct. Up until the point where the bank starts financing the construction. The bank doesn't finance the construction until the developer has a building permit.
So if a new developer asks for more than 7% before he has the permits, that's illegal.
Yeah, you
keep away. Keep away.
You don't want to do that. You want to, and most people bring lawyers, most people bring attorneys. Today, it's very, very acceptable. I would strongly recommend that anyone who buys a apartment on plan get a local attorney.
We're going to have an episode on the legal aspects of buying off plan as well.
Very smart to do that. But from a financial perspective, the bank really, once he gets involved, for every dollar or shekel that the buyer puts in or pays to the seller, he gets what's called an arvut, which essentially is referred to in English more like a bond, where there's security on the money that the buyer put down, that it specifically is geared toward what happens if, God forbid, something happens to the seller? What happens if, God forbid, something happens to the developer? And essentially, what it enables is the bank to come in and finish the project for the homeowner. And the money that he's already paid doesn't go to waste or doesn't, he has to start chasing someone who really isn't around anymore. So really, from that perspective, the process that's used here in Israel is very much enforced. again, from the pre-planning stage, from the pre-sale stage of the 7% put into escrow. The escrow from the seller's attorney is usually where the money goes into.
So how secure is that if it's his attorney?
Yeah, that's okay. I don't think that that's a problem. The money all has to be sitting in the seller's attorney's escrow account. Escrow here in Israel is very much governed very, very strictly. You don't typically find situations where attorneys or lawyers do things with an escrow account and start using money. They can lose their license for something like that, but there are probably a lot more people who are much more knowledgeable about how that works than I am.
When is the money released from the escrow?
Yeah, so once the bank starts the process of signing the construction loan with the developer, once the permit is in, once there is a signed contract with the builder, then at that point, typically the attorney of the seller will call in the buyers again. They'll have to sign on some documentation that the bank requires them to sign on, because essentially up until that point, the buyer put money into the seller's escrow account. And then after that happens, the buyer has to agree to release the money from the escrow and put it into an account that's specifically for just this particular project.
This project, not for another project that he's building down the road or in another city. It has to be for this project.
It's only for this project. And not just that, but any money that gets released from that account needs to be approved by the bank's appraiser on a monthly basis after the developer says, look, I've done this amount. I need to pay my contractor this amount. I need to pay my architect this amount. I need to pay my engineers this amount.
I built 3 out of 25 floors. So the appraiser comes along, appraises the value of the building.
He actually comes out to the site. He usually walks around with the foreman of the developer or the contractor himself. He sees what was done. He looks over the contract. He looks over the bill that the contractor gave to the developer. And only with his approval can the money be released from that particular account to the contractor himself. So
fantastic.
From the buyer's perspective, it's extremely enforced, very, very careful as to how that money is used and how that money is spent.
That's really good to know. It's very reassuring for buyers to know that their money is only going to the builder when he's completed certain stages of the construction, and the rest is held by the lawyer in escrow. The
local joke that developers use here regarding that process, which is called a livui bankai, is that as a developer, if you even need to go so far as ask permission to go to the bathroom, you have to ask the appraiser in order to allow you to do that, because there's very, very few things that the developer can do with that money without the express approval of the bank.
Sure. So livui bankai is the bank's accompaniment. The word livui we all know from the word levaya, but it's the same word that we accompany shaloneda, that we should know we accompany,
So there are a couple of banks, not many here in Israel, that provide that. There are now, over the last bunch of years, some insurance companies that also have that infrastructure in order to be able to provide those types of financing for developers. You've got probably anywhere between 7 and 8 total, about 4 or 5 banks and another 4 or 5 different insurance companies that really can provide those types of infrastructure.
That's great.
To provide that for
So
the
when
buyers.
looking at a project, how relevant is it to ask or to look into who is the bank?
Very much so. It's very, very relevant. You always want to make sure that even if you get in early and you give the money and put it into escrow, you need to make sure that the only time and the only option that you have for that money to be released from the escrow account is if it's given to the bank hamelaveh, either a bank or the insurance company. Typically, once construction has already started, so usually at that point, pre-sale is sort of over. And basically, it's just a fancy term to say that you can get a better discount, for your apartment from the developer, because the bank wants to reduce his exposure. And the bank actually, one of the requirements that he has to the developer in order to finance a project is that the developer has to sell a certain percentage of the units on paper before the bank is even willing to start financing the project, because he wants to make sure that it's a project that people are actually going to want to buy apartments in.
Great. So a pre-sale is a great opportunity to come in and get a good price and close quickly before they get the permits.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that's always advantageous from a buyer's perspective. From the bank's perspective, as I mentioned, once that process starts, so it's really, really very, very formal. And it's very, very important to know who the bank hamalava is from the buyer's perspective.
So what we ask who the bank hamalava is. We're told a name. What difference does it make? How do we know which are the good ones or the less good ones?
So there really aren't that many who are not good ones, meaning you have certain companies today that can offer these types of services. But I think that the real question that the buyer wants to know is who's providing me with my arvuyot, who's providing me with my what's called arvuyot chok mecher, which is essentially the bond that I discussed earlier that provides security to the buyer to make sure that the money that he is spending and the money that he's using, he actually gets a physical piece of paper stating this is the amount that you've already put into the project, this is the amount that you've already paid, and this is the amount that we're providing you with this bond. So
we're looking for like the big name banks and insurance companies?
Yeah, Bank Hapoalim, Bank Leumi,
Phoenix.
Mizrahi Tvachot, Phoenix, absolutely.
So the no-name companies are those that we have to inquire more about. It doesn't mean that they're not good, but we just have to delve a bit deeper. Are there ever situations where a developer does not have an accompanying bank?
So you have that years ago, actually, the way that we built in Haifa, we didn't have a bank hamalava. It's very, very expensive for the developer. And it just sort of worked out where we were able to do that. I'm not familiar now, we're going, 10, 12 years later, of any projects here in Israel that do not have this PAI that they provide to the developer. And I would go so far as to say that most buyers' attorneys will strongly discourage a buyer to buy in a project on paper unless the seller can offer him those arvayot, those bonds for the money that he's putting in.
Makes sense. Absolutely. Okay, so that's really addressing the financial risk of purchasing off plan. What about the practical risk? What if the builder does not develop on time? I'm making aliyah and I was planning to move into my apartment, or I've sold my other home and I need to move in.
Yeah. So, from the buyer's perspective, we mentioned a couple of different stages that he could potentially purchase. If he purchases very early on, even before the permit is in hand, so typically what he should ask for from the seller, from the developer, is how long until you get the permit. And there has to be a way that the buyer can walk away if, God forbid, the developer doesn't come up with the permit on time. Once the permit is in hand, so then there's a commitment also from the seller, from the developer, to provide the apartment and give over the keys within a certain amount of time. Let's say it's 100 condos in one building, and I'm, as a buyer, coming in at pre-sale. So I will negotiate and I'll tell my seller, the developer, look, I want maximum of 12 months from today until you get the building permit. If you don't have the building permit within 12 months, then I, as the buyer, can walk away. I can get my money back.
Right.
And then once the permit is in hand, there's a certain amount of time that has to be committed from the developer's perspective to give over the apartment, let's say 36 months or 48 months or whatever the negotiated
And what happens
one is.
if he doesn't meet those deadlines?
Right. So in terms of the first deadline of when the permit is in hand, usually there aren't any sanctions from the developer's perspective in that scenario for the buyer to be able to receive from the developer. Usually at that point, he'll just get his money back and he'll just sort of walk away. There's what's called mas rechisha, which is a purchase tax that he should be able to get back at that point. But in that scenario, usually there isn't any knas, or there isn't any payment penalty that the developer would have to pay to the buyer. However, once the permit is in hand and once the actual contract materializes to the point where I no longer have what's called a tanai matle, where it's contingent upon you receiving the permit. Once the permit is already in, so now all of a sudden there's no more contingencies in my contract with the developer as a buyer. Now I have however many months that the developer committed to me in order to give me my apartment. Typically what happens if the developer does not provide the apartment on time is that there's sort of a built-in method that the owner, the buyer, would be able to receive as a penalty for the late delivery. Usually there's a grace period of about 60 days that the developer has in order to provide. Let's say I tell you, as the developer says to the buyer, you have until June 1st, 2025, let's say. So up until August 1st, I wouldn't have to pay any penalties if I'm the seller and I'm giving over the apartment. Once August 2nd happens, so now the first 60 days, I have to now pay you. Usually it's a month's rent for that type of apartment that you would get in that particular area. And that usually ends up being defined by the appraiser.
And you have to pay retroactively to the beginning of the grace period.
Exactly. So those 60 days you have grace, but once day 61 starts, so you go back to day one, meaning June 1st. So for the whole month of June and for the whole month of July and any future months until you actually get delivery of your apartment, that amount the developer would then have to pay you.
So the developer is really incentivized to deliver on time.
Oh, very much so. And typically what happens is that you as the buyer still have a lot of money that you need to give to the developer, to the seller. So when you come in, when finally the apartment is finished, when you have what's called Tofas Arba, which is certificate of occupancy, and the apartment is ready, you go in before you receive the apartment and you sit down with the developer and you work out all of what you have left to pay him. So what usually happens is that instead of the developer paying you money on a monthly basis for the delays, he essentially just takes off from the final bill that you have to pay to the developer.
Okay, good. Wow, Ellie, this has been really, really amazing and incredibly helpful for everybody, including myself. You've explained things in a way that very few people can explain in English. On a personal note, Ellie, I understand that you're building some residential units now. Do you see more interest from overseas, from people that are interested in buying from abroad? Yeah,
I mean, I would say that there are many people today who I never would have thought. I'm very much still in touch with many, many people in the U.S., both in Boston, New York, friends, family, mainly on the East Coast, who 20 years ago, thought that I was kind of crazy to move to Israel. I don't know if I would have necessarily disagreed with them then 20 years ago. It was a big, big step. But now looking back, I think that there are many, many people who are very much talking about moving here, or at least having a presence here.
It's unbelievable. Wow.
It's a little scary. It's something that I didn't ever really anticipate. And I feel that, I sort of have come here and I've sort of learned the system. And quite frankly, I have people who call me sometimes and just sort of ask me for my opinion. They have their lawyers, they have their engineers, or they have their brokers, but they just sort of looking to kind of spend, an hour meeting with me or even over a phone call and sort of describe what it is that they're doing. I would say that if nothing else, that I have been able to, sort of in my small corner of the world, be able to help people in any which way, fulfill their dream of buying an apartment, here in Israel. I feel like I've sort of, accomplished something that, maybe not everybody has that opportunity.
It's really, really special, Ellie. That's unbelievable. And I can relate because I feel like what who's in this business is doing is, first of all, building the land, developing the land, and helping others fulfill the dream of settling the land. And hopefully, there's no guarantee of anything, but it's certainly somewhat of a security to have a place to come to. And please God, it will bring them here even quicker.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are many people who, unfortunately have heard many, many what I would refer to as war stories of difficult and challenging things that have happened to them, dealing with a different culture, dealing with Israel, dealing with Israelis. And I always tell, my family back in Boston, my father, it's not better, it's not worse, it's just different. And for people who have been successful and if people who have been sort of used to doing things a certain way in the US, which, sort of I'm familiar with on a personal level, to translate that into Israel requires an interpreter. It requires some form of recognition that the touch points that I use and the hunches that I use in order to make decisions in the US don't always translate here in Israel. And I think that that's the reason why people sometimes are not sure.
They trust you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's it's a cultural thing. It's a language thing. It's something that people just feel more comfortable when they're talking to someone who they can relate to. And sometimes it's hard for the American to relate to the Israeli, and sometimes it's hard for the Israeli to relate to the American. Just to share a story, I had a friend of mine from Camp Raleigh many, many years ago called me recently, and he was looking to buy an apartment in Yerushalayim. And he was specifically talking to me about this madad issue, about the index. Mm-hmm. He didn't have any specific question, but he just wanted to get my take and my perspective on what this is all about. And he ended up buying, and he's very happy. And he ended up, he ended up being, being very happy with his decision. But if it's something that people just feel uncomfortable with, it happens a lot.
So thank you, Ellie. Besides encouraging people to buy something here in Israel, you've given a lot of people inspiration and hope for those who may feel a little bit overwhelmed, or, it's daunting to come to a foreign land, a foreign country, foreign language, and foreign culture. And you are, a real success story. So really well done. And yishar koach, as we say in Hebrew, and keep up the amazing work.
Thank you so much.
I must finish with 2 final questions, Ellie. Could you tell us, where do you live in Israel and why?
So we live in Alon Shvut, which is in Gush Etzion, just south of Yerushalayim. When we moved here in 2004, it fulfilled a lot of what we were looking for, being close to Yerushalayim. We had a bunch of friends who lived there. The lifestyle really worked. And ever since then, we ended up buying our home there. We become very close with Rav Rimon, who is a close personal friend, as well as our Rav in the community.
Very nice. Did you build your home?
No, we actually bought it secondhand.
Okay.
And thank God. I mean, it's really been very good to us. Our kids really love it. Yesterday was Purim, and 2 days ago rather, and we had a whole Suda, and all of our kids were there, and we had a lot of friends there, and some of the local kids in the neighborhood also came by. So it's a very special place. It's nice to be able to call home, not just your home itself, but also the community that you live in.
So
and that's
special,
really what we
beautiful.
felt.
What a zchut. We feel so fortunate, so lucky that we've merited to be living here, living in the land and living the ultimate dream. And finally, Ellie, if you were to move to a different area in the country, where would you go and why?
So that's a hard question. I don't really see us moving outside of Alon Shvut.
No reason to.
I think that if we could ever have an opportunity to have another home, or to spend some time sort of outside, of the home that we live in, and spend some significant time, whether it's the summers or whatnot, or on Chagim. I think the nice thing about Israel is that it's such a small country, but it has so many different climates. It has
amazing.
So many different parts. Like up north is very, very green, open fields.
Snow.
In the summertime, in the wintertime, you can go skiing. You have a beautiful coastal area, from Caesarea all the way down to Rishon LeZion and Ashdod.
Absolutely.
And then, you have your Eilat, which is all the way down south, and people go there to vacation. Personally, I love the ocean. I love the water, and I love spending time near the beach. But I think that one of the special things about Israel is that even though it's such a small place, there are so many different types of climates that you can really move to, and different areas. People ask me all the time, tell me about the economy, tell me about the real estate in Israel. And it's hard for someone coming from the U.S., which is such a large country, to understand, but it's really different, from Afula to Metula to Netanya to Yerushalayim to Tel Aviv and Herzliya, Petach Tikva.
Unbelievable. You can get so much. In one day, you can drive from Eilat all the way up to the Hermon Mountains, and get so much from both different angles, different perspectives.
Yeah, the climate and the
okay,
but
give us one place. You got to give us one place.
I like Netanya. I think Netanya is a very, very special city.
We got it. Fantastic. Ellie, thank you so much. We really appreciate this. And you better share this podcast with all your family, friends, and investors, because you've shared so much information.
Absolutely.
They're going to want to hear it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to On the House. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and share it with your family and friends. You can also visit buyitisrael.com, where you can find news, market updates, guidance, and much more on real estate in Israel. That's Buy It in Israel, BUYIT in Israel.com. If you have a question or a specific topic you'd like us to cover on this podcast, please email us at the address you'll find at the bottom of the show notes. Whether you're thinking about Aliyah, looking for a home or a haven, or wanting to support the Israeli economy, now is the time to buy it in Israel.